Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this very special day today, the 10th of May 2023. 13 degrees and sunny in Brisbane. Are we all enjoying the cold change? Well, it's a little bit too cold right in the morning when we go about our walks. But today is a historic day because that budget that got passed down yesterday. So we'll take an in-depth look at that. And of course, the coalition is saying that the surplus that's been in the budget is a gift from them. But let's take a look at what it said. Let's see how it was handed down.
Speaker, we acknowledge the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people, the Yuggera and the Yugambeh country around Logan, and all the First Nations of Australia, their elders, customs and traditions. And we recognise the opportunity that we have this year to move forward together, listening to each other in a spirit of unity and respect. Yes. Mr Speaker, the budget we present to the Australian people tonight provides cost of living relief that is responsible and affordable and prioritises those most in need. It delivers historic investments in Medicare and the care economy, making it easier and cheaper for Australians to see their doctor. It broadens opportunity by breaking down the barriers of disadvantage and exclusion. It lays the foundations for growth by embracing clean energy and investing in value-adding industries, people, skills, technology and small business. And it strengthens the budget with a surplus forecast for this year with less debt than smaller deficits compared with recent budgets. These are the foundations on which our government is building a stronger economy and a fairer society, with greater security in a time of economic uncertainty, more opportunities in more parts of our country, and a renewed determination for Australia to make the most of the defining decade ahead. Speaker, in all of our decisions we seek to strike a considered, methodical balance between spending restraint to keep the pressure off inflation while doing what we can to help people struggling to make ends meet, making sure that vital services like Medicare and the National Disability Insurance Scheme are secure and reliable and sustainable, and dealing with immediate near-term challenges while investing in our long-term national economic success, seeing our people through the hard times and setting our country up for a better future. Mr Speaker, the global economy is slowing due to persistent inflation, higher interest rates and financial sector strains. Outside of the pandemic and the global financial crisis, the next 2 years are expected to be the weakest for global growth in over 2 decades, and this will affect us here in Australia. Our economic growth is expected to slow from 3.25% this year to 1.5% next year before recovering to 2.25% the one after. Despite this, our economy will continue to create jobs and unemployment is expected to remain low by historical standards, 4.25% in 23-24, 4.5% the year after. And in this environment, inflation remains our primary economic challenge. It drives rate rises and it erodes real wages, which is why this budget is carefully calibrated to alleviate inflationary pressures, not add to them. Our policies to ease the pressure on households will take 0.75 percentage point off inflation in 23-24, which is expected to fall from 6% this year to 3.25% next year, returning to the Reserve Bank's target band in 2024-25. Still higher than we'd like, for longer than we'd like, but tracking in the right direction. So while Australia may have a lot coming at us, we have a lot going for us as well. High prices for the things we sell overseas, a strong, well-regulated, secure banking system, low unemployment, and welcome signs that after a decade of being kept deliberately low, wages are moving again. Yeah. Wages growth for 2023-24 is now forecast to be 4%, up 0.25 percentage point from what was expected in October. This combination of lower than expected inflation and higher wages means that an earlier and stronger return to real wages growth is forecast for 2023-24. Speaker, at the same time, we understand that Australians are under the pump right now, and that's why providing responsible, targeted relief is the #1 priority in this budget. Our $14.6 billion cost of living plan will provide help with power bills, bring down out-of-pocket health costs, support vulnerable Australians, create more affordable housing and boost wages. Speaker, back in November, gas bills were set to go up by 20% in 23-24 and electricity bills were set to rise by 36%. Now, this was the high price Australians were slated to pay for the Russian invasion of Ukraine and a decade of energy policy failure here at home. Our government refused to stand by and let this happen. We took urgent and targeted action to place a cap on coal and gas prices, and tonight we are delivering up to $3 billion in direct energy bill relief for eligible households and small businesses co-funded with the states and territories. More than 5 million households will have up to $500 deducted from their power bills in the next financial year. Real relief right off your power bill, right when you need it. And because of our policies, electricity price increases are expected to be around 25 percentage points less than what was projected, and 16 percentage points less for gas. And a big part of making sure that energy bills are more affordable into the future is improving the energy efficiency of Australian homes, and not just new builds. Through this budget, we are investing $1 billion to help provide low-cost loans for double glazing and solar panels and other improvements that will make homes easier and cheaper to keep cool in summer and warm in winter. A common-sense program that will help family budgets and reduce emissions. Speaker, our first budget capped the price of medicines on the Pharmaceutical Benefits Scheme for around 3.6 million Australians, so that most now pay no more than $30 for the medicines that they need. In our second budget, we're investing $2.2 billion to increase access to life-changing medicines through the PBS. And from September this year, patients will be able to get more of the medicine they need for less money and less hassle. Instead of having to go back to their pharmacist every month, many people with common chronic illnesses will be able to get 2 months' worth of treatment for over 300 different medicines. This change will save people up to $180 a year, and for millions of Australians, the cost of medicines will be cut in half. Speaker, our government is proud that in our first year in office, 339,000 new jobs have been created. But even with unemployment at historic lows, we know there are still people struggling to find work and struggling to get by. The pressures on the budget are acute, but as a Labor government, we will always strive to help those who need it the most. That's why tonight we announce a $40 per fortnight increase for JobSeeker recipients, plus those on youth allowance, Austudy and other income support payments, helping to deliver a much-needed $4.9 billion boost in support to around 1.1 million Australians looking for work, studying or doing apprenticeships. And we are going further to help the single biggest group of Australians on JobSeeker, those aged 55 and over. Until now, people aged 60 and over and on payments for a long time have received a higher rate in recognition of the additional barriers that they face finding work. But the truth is, it gets more difficult earlier than that. The majority of people aged 55 and over on JobSeeker are women, many with little to no savings or superannuation, and who are at risk of homelessness. So tonight we're extending the extra support for those aged 60 and over to include Australians 55 and over. More help for some of the most vulnerable people in our community. And in the same spirit, we're expanding parenting payments single, so it will now be available to single parents until their youngest child turns 14 rather than 8. This will provide 57,000 families with an extra $176.90 per fortnight. Over 90% of these parents are single mums. They deserve our respect and our support for the incredible job that they do. Speaker, for too long, secure, affordable housing has been out of reach for too many Australians. Tonight, to help ease the pressure on people feeling the pain of rising rents, we are increasing the maximum rates of Commonwealth rent assistance by 15%. This will provide up to $31 extra a fortnight for people renting in the private market and community housing, the largest increase in more than 30 years. But we know an essential part of the solution to pressures in the housing market is more homes for Australians. Our housing accord aims to build 1 million new well-located homes over 5 years from 2024. We're going to help drive this with a new tax break for build-to-rent projects, cutting the Managed Investment Trust withholding tax from 30% to 15%. And by increasing the liability cap of the National Housing Finance and Investment Corporation by $2 billion to support more lending to community housing providers. We want more Australians to know the security of a roof over their head, which is why we're also working with the states and territories to improve planning, to build more houses and to deliver a better deal for renters. For this same reason, implementation of the $10 billion Housing Australia Future Fund is critical to build more of the social and affordable houses that our people need. Speaker, our government came to office promising to get wages moving again. They're now growing at their fastest rate since 2012. And let's be clear, when it comes to the cost of living, fair wages for workers are not the problem, they're part of the solution. Meaningful and sustainable wages growth is a fundamental feature of an economy that rewards people for their hard work. Meaningful and sustainable wages growth is why we've consistently advocated for low-paid Australians so they don't go backwards. The Prime Minister has said it many times, the heroes of the pandemic deserve more than our thanks. They deserve fair pay for their vital work. I'm proud that our budget provides $11.3 billion to fund a 15% increase in award wages for more than 250,000 aged care workers. This pay rise will help retain, reward and recruit the hard-working people who care for our loved ones as they grow old. And the message from our government to the aged care workers of Australia is very simple. You deserve every cent.
So there you are. You heard it directly from the Treasurer himself, and that was delivered. Well, right now, let's take a look at some of the key elements of the budget.
Hi, everyone.
The suit, the books and their numbers all tell the story, out of the blue and into the black.
We're really proud of this budget.
Second time around, Jim Chalmers is armed with a surprise slender surplus, thanks to surging revenue, much saved, some spent so as to not stoke inflation.
And are you confident that this additional spending won't actually make matters worse?
This budget has been very carefully calibrated to address the cost of living challenges in our economy.
To be precise, a $14 billion package. To help take the sting out of winter power bills, the budget includes $1.5 billion worth of federal energy bill relief. In a deal struck with states, more than 5 million low-income households will be eligible for subsidies, shaving up to $500 off their energy bills. For up to 1 million small businesses, that figure can grow to up to $650.
Take a deeper breath for me, please.
Seeing the doctor will be cheaper for more than 11.5 million people. $3.5 billion will go towards expanding free bulk bill GP visits for children aged under 16, pensioners and Commonwealth concession card holders.
That's an important cost. Anyone who's had kids and had to take them to the doctors knows that.
After a long campaign for a substantial increase to the JobSeeker payment, a modest lift is on the way. JobSeeker Youth Allowance and AusStudy will increase by $40 per fortnight, or $2.80 a day, while more older Australians without a job will become eligible for a higher JobSeeker rate at 55 years of age instead of 60. Single parents will be able to claim the single parenting payment until their youngest child turns 14. That's up from 8. A $1.9 billion investment estimated to help 52,000 single mums currently receiving the lower rate JobSeeker. As the rental crisis deepens, some Australians will get extra support. Tonight, Labor confirming the maximum rate of Commonwealth rent assistance will be lifted by 15%, worth just under $3 billion over 5 years. That's a $31 fortnightly increase in support for low-income renters. Higher income tax from record employment and booming commodity prices have gifted government coffers a temporary boost. Compared to where he thought he'd be back in October, the Treasurer's had a $40 billion turnaround to a surplus due in June. But it'll be short-lived. This budget forecasts an immediate slide back into the red, then staying there for the next 3 years. It's not all revenue gain without pain. The tax take is going up on gas exports, multinational companies and those who evade the GST. The worst of inflation is now behind us, but lingering on for another 2 years. The government insists its spending will not make the cost of living crisis worse, and energy bill relief will in fact bring inflation down. Even if this budget does its bit to tackle that problem, it leaves for later years the big gulf between rising ongoing costs and more regular levels of revenue.
Nobody here, not Katie or I or anyone in the Cabinet, pretends that it is mission accomplished when it comes to putting the budget on a much more sustainable footing.
That falls to him next year.
I think he's quite confident in the way that he just delivered that budget. Good to see our Queenslander on that top role. Well, right now, what does the opposition or Peter Dutton have to say on the budget?
The budget's back in black. Does the government get a tick for that?
Well, I think they do get a tick, and frankly, I think if they're being gracious, they should acknowledge that they inherited a pretty good set of figures. They've obviously had a surge of income, and they've spent some of that wisely, but there's a lot of extra taxing and lots of extra spending, which is going to be inflationary. And as Chris Richardson points out, he thought the Reserve Bank governor had already finished with the baseball bat, but he thinks that there is likely another interest rate increase out of this. So I worry for those families who are missing out and who are really hurting at the moment.
The Treasurer and by extension the Treasury says the spending measures, the cost of living relief will knock 0.75% off inflation though next year.
Well, I just don't get that when you're spending $185 billion extra in spending, when you're creating a problem, which is exactly what they've done, particularly in relation to energy. You've got a band-aid for it in the short term, but in 12 and 18 months' time, those families are still going to have big power bills, and in this budget they're still projecting that your power bill will go up by about $500, which is a huge turnaround from the Prime Minister's promise before the election that your power bill would go down by $275 each year.
You support, though, the energy relief payments?
Well, we support those payments to families in the way in which the government's proposed them, but it's a short-term fix. And the problem is that it's a long-term problem that they've created. And there are lots of families, millions of families, who aren't getting any assistance in this budget, who thought they were. An average family with a mortgage, 3 children, $25,000 worse. They're worse off under Labor in this budget, and that's a huge hit.
But you're calling by saying all of that for more spending, and therefore that would further stoke inflation.
Well, there's things that the government could have done in the budget. For example, there's no mention of infrastructure. There was no mention of productivity. So there are things that they could have done to reduce the inflationary pressures. But in this budget, as the independent economic advisors have pointed out, the government is putting upward pressure on inflation, which is going to make it harder for the Reserve Bank.
Do you support the increase in JobSeeker payments?
Well, we're going to assess that. Obviously, we've been in the lockup like the media yesterday. We haven't had months.
But you know the basic figure, $40 a fortnight.
And we'll look at all of those figures, and we'll make an announcement in relation to that tomorrow night.
In my budget not supporting that increase?
We'll make an announcement tomorrow. We've certainly spoken a lot about trying to provide support to people on lower incomes, but there are millions of Australians who have missed out significantly in this budget. They're the ones that I think are really hurting at the moment, and we'll have more to say about that tomorrow night.
The single parent payment, the extension of that, do you support that?
Well, again, we'll have more to say about that, Michael, tomorrow night, and some other measures as well.
Don't single mums, though, deserve all the help they can get?
Well, of course they do, and there are millions of families more, single parent families, families with kids who are $25,000 worse off under this government, and there are lots of people that deserve support because Labor has created a huge cost of living crisis, and in this budget they put upward pressure on interest rates at exactly the wrong time.
Medicare, the $3.5 billion to help encourage more GPs to offer bulk billing. Do you support that?
Well, again, we'll have more to say about that, but clearly more needs to be done in the bulk billing space, and more needs to be done in general practice and in primary care. So in principle, we support more assistance to doctors to help them see patients, particularly those with acute needs and those that require regular attendance at GPs, and that includes pensioners and kids, etc., as the government's proposed last night.
Stage 3 tax cuts, the Treasurer confirmed last night that cost $69 billion over the next 4 years. Does the opposition continue to support those?
Well, of course we do, because they've been legislated. We went to an election promising it, as did the Prime Minister, and there are about 17 broken promises now that the Prime Minister sits on, and surely he's not going to add this one to the list as well.
But you're fine with them going ahead and potentially feeding more money into the economy?
Well, I think they come in at the right time. They were staged for a reason. They haven't come in at the moment because we don't want to see that extra spending in an inflationary environment. But I do think as you come out of the inflationary period, you do want to be providing support to families who are still going to have massive electricity and gas bills to pay under Labor's policies.
So the Treasury does predict inflation is starting to trend down, so that's another positive.
Well, there are some pretty heroic predictions in the budget, if I might say, and I've been around budgets and ERCs long enough to know that Treasurers have a pretty heavy hand in some of the assumptions and the way in which Treasury arrive at those calculations. So
the Treasurer would interfere.
I just wouldn't trust this Treasurer in terms of the numbers. I would wait to see what happens once the coalition money has run out. So they're projecting this small budget for the first year, which is what they've been bequeathed from a Liberal government. When they're on their own over the next 3 and 4 years, they're projecting heavy deficits in each year, growing each year, and that's what happens when you lock in structural spend off the back of a windfall or a sugar hit, as we've seen.
Okay, and everybody agrees the structural deficit has to be tackled. What would you cut? And what serious tax reform would you bring in if you were running the show?
We'll have our policies before the next election, Michael. The government's got to deal with the here and now. Their opportunity in the budget last night was to invest. They've made an announcement that they're going to bring in 1.5 million people over a 5-year period, which would be the highest number in the migrant program in our country's history, and at the same time they're cutting infrastructure spending. So we've got a housing crisis, we've got a rental crisis, and they're bringing in 1.5 million people in over a 5-year period. Congestion is a huge issue in our cities, and they're ripping money out of roads and public transport. So it doesn't add up. So there are lots of mistakes and missed opportunities in this budget, and there's lots of things that we support as well.
Can we expect policy announcements in your address and reply speech tomorrow night?
Well, I just want to build expectation. I want you to be excited by what it is tomorrow night.
I just want to know what's coming up.
You want the splash?
By all means.
I'll leave it till tomorrow night, but we've been, I think, contemplating a lot we're not 12 months into opposition yet, so we've got 2 years to go until the election. So there'll be some announcements tomorrow night, but also there'll be obviously advices where we support the government, where we critique what's in there in the budget from last night, and I just really feel for those families who have missed out, who have had their power prices jacked up at a time when the Prime Minister promised to reduce them, and you've got a scenario where they got no assistance in this budget at all.
Okay, a bit going on outside the budget before you go. Stuart Robert, your long-time colleague, has announced he is resigning from his seat of Fadden on the Gold Coast. Will that by-election be a test of your leadership?
Well, it's always a test in a by-election because people aren't happy about having to go back to the polls. In Aston, we know that people had to go to the polls 3 times in 10 months, and that creates a level of frustration. Equally, when you look back over history, there are normally 4 or 5 by-elections post a change of government, and we will deal with that. We've got some great candidates who are lining up, and will campaign well. I think the government is hurting a lot of people in a seat like Fadden, and we'll be talking a lot about that in the campaign right up to election day, whenever that might be.
Peter Dutton, really appreciate your time this morning.
So there you go. You've had it now from Peter Dutton himself. And right now, moving on, let's see what the Greens have to say on this.
So let's start again with JobSeeker, an extra $2.85 a day, $40 per fortnight. It's clearly not enough, and I know you're going to say that, but a welcome move in the right direction.
Well, it's not even enough to buy a loaf of bread. Labor promised that no one would be left behind. Labor's budget leaves millions of people behind, giving tax cuts to the politicians and billionaires, while everyday people on JobSeeker are left in poverty. By spending $250 billion on tax cuts for the wealthy, Labor has betrayed renters, job seekers and everyone who's doing it tough. The big gas corporations get away with paying next to nothing. Politicians and billionaires get a $9,000 a year tax cut, while too many people are being stuck and left in poverty.
Okay, we have other measures as well, like the 15% increase in the Commonwealth Rent Assistance payment, going some way to helping tackle the housing problem. Do you welcome that?
Well, we're in a rental crisis. 5.5 million renters get absolutely nothing out of this budget. Those lucky enough to get rent assistance might get about $1 a day. Rents in capital cities have been growing 10 times faster than that. I think Labor just doesn't understand how severe the rental and housing crisis is. People are sleeping in tents and cars. People are spending 60% of their income on rents, and at the moment there's crumbs on from the table for some, and millions of people get nothing at all. Labor is shifting the burden of dealing with the cost of living crisis away from the wealthy and the big gas corporations who get handouts onto everyday people.
But do you understand the argument the government's making? Clearly it would have liked to offer more to people, the most vulnerable Australians, but it doesn't want to risk stoking inflation, which will hurt more people if that leads the Reserve Bank to raise interest rates.
Well, I don't think helping with job seekers are able to put a banana in their kid's lunchbox. That's not what's driving inflation. Like, helping people deal with the massive cost of living crisis is just the bare necessity. That's not what's going to drive inflation. What's driving inflation? High power bills, high rent, high costs of housing that's being driven by the massive profits being made by these big corporations. What Labor should have done is made the big gas corporations pay their fair share of tax, rein in excessive profiteering, freeze rents and power bills, and use the money raised from all of those taxes on the big corporations to lift people out of poverty. They haven't done that. They're asking everyday people to bear the burden while letting the wealthy and the big corporations off the hook.
On another front, some initiatives to move Australia towards what the government hopes will be a clean energy future. $2 billion to promote renewable hydrogen. Good move?
Look, the Greens welcomed the increased spend on climate. The Greens secured a third of that increased spend on climate with a $2 billion package to help households, businesses and people in public housing get off gas, and so we welcome that. And it's good to see a lift in spend on climate, but it's worth remembering that in this budget Labor's spending more on fossil fuel subsidies than they are on their total climate spend, so still a long way to go.
Stage 3 tax cuts, as we've mentioned, the costs revealed last night, $69 billion over 4 years, close to $300 billion over the decade. Clearly not going anywhere. Do you see the argument that a lot of Australians are suffering because of bracket creep? Those tax cuts should...
So there you are. Now you've had it from the Greens as well. We've heard from Liberals, and Peter Dutton said that he will support some of the moves, and he did also mention that the government should appreciate that the surplus is not just today's, it's what their government, the previous government, left for them as well. And the Greens is saying that the budget does not go far enough. It's faltered on many of the promises that they made. Now, let's hear from our Prime Minister.
Budget last night, $20 billion in new spending. Is that really going to help force the inflation dragon back into its cave?
$40 billion of savings over 2 budgets, 87% of the revenue gains put to the bottom line, unlike our predecessors where the number was 40%. or the Howard government where the number was 30%. This is a budget that takes pressure off families whilst not putting pressure on inflation.
But there is that extra spending out there, and independent economist Chris Richardson reckons that the RBA was ready to lay off further rate rises until last night. He says they'll look at these new spending measures and perhaps
Well, he's got to get a run on ABC,
raise
doesn't
rates
he?
again. No,
if he didn't say something dramatic, you wouldn't be giving him a run, and then he wouldn't get another run.
He makes a valid point, though, doesn't he?
Well, come on. We are producing the first projected surplus in 15 years. We're banking, putting 87% of the revenue gains to the bottom line. We've produced $40 billion of savings over 2 budgets. This is a responsible budget that deals with the pressure of inflation which is there, whilst also understanding that we need to assist people who are under pressure. Which of the measures did Mr Richardson say we shouldn't have done?
Let's talk about one of those measures. JobSeeker going up by $40 a fortnight. That equates to $2.85 a day. Independent Senator David Pocock describes that as both laughable and embarrassing. Are you embarrassed to offer only such a small rise in JobSeeker?
Here's the great contradiction that you've just put in the first two issues you've raised with me. You've said we're spending too much in your first question, and the second you say we're not spending enough. The truth is we've got the balance right. We understand that people are under pressure, but we needed to make sure that it was a responsible budget. So this $40 increase is something that will make a difference to people.
Medicare, the $3.5 billion to help encourage more GPs to offer bulk billing. Who is eligible for that, and how will it actually encourage GPs to bring in more bulk billing?
Well, it'll make an enormous difference, particularly for children will be eligible for that, for example. So one of the pressures that families are under, and that's what you've got to look at, is not just every individual payment, but how it all fits together. So you've got cheaper childcare. You've got increases in some payments targeted to those most who need it, people on JobSeeker, single parenting payment expansion, which is there, increased rental assistance for those in the private or community housing sector, all working together as well as making cheaper medicines and making it easier to see a bulk billing doctor. Not just the tripling of incentives, but the additional urgent care clinics as well that are taking pressure off the emergency departments. This is a budget that will look after people and lay such strong foundations for the better future that we promised.
Housing is such a massive issue, as you know, as we know. Every morning we speak about it on our show. An 15% increase in the Commonwealth rental assistance payment. Advocates were calling for a much greater increase, but what do you hope that 15% does?
Well, it'll make a difference to people who are under pressure due to rising rents, but it's not the only thing we're doing, Michael. Once again, it's a comprehensive plan. Our housing accord for 1 million extra homes to be built. The incentives that we put into last night's budget for build-to-rent schemes added to the private sector to provide them with incentives to engage in housing supply. Our legislation that's before the Parliament could be a vote today to provide some 30,000 additional social and affordable homes, including 4,000 targeted at women and children escaping domestic violence. Now, that $10 billion Housing Australia Future Fund is before the Parliament today, so a comprehensive plan. Public housing, incentives for investment in private housing supply, a housing supply and affordability council run with the states and local government to increase that housing supply, to look at planning laws and to make sure that we deal with those issues, incentives to invest. These all put together show a government that is committed to dealing with the pressures that are there on housing.
Stage 3 tax cuts, the Treasurer confirmed they'll cost $69 billion over 4 years. Your cost of living package comes in at $15 billion. Can you see how some people out there, perhaps more than some people, would see a massive disconnect?
Well, they, of course, were legislated some time ago. They're included in the budget, as they have been for some time, and we have no plans to change those measures. We haven't given consideration to that.
But you can see, I'll ask the question again, can you see how some people would see $69 billion for tax cuts targeting in large part wealthy Australians compared to only $15 billion?
Well, of course, those measures begin at $45,000. If you're on $45,000 watching this program, you don't regard yourself as being wealthy.
Just very quickly, I know you've got to go, Prime Minister, something that hasn't got a lot of coverage, but I think should. There's money there for the referendum, which is right because we have a referendum coming up, but also $10.5 million in mental health support for Indigenous Australians in the referendum period. What does that say about the impact this debate is having on First Nations people?
Well, it is having a difficult impact. There are words that are used these days on social media and in other forms, often anonymous. Sometimes not, frankly. Some of the things that are being said in this debate are hurtful. We're very conscious of the pressure which Indigenous Australians will be under. We know that when the vote, the postal ballot was held on marriage equality, then people in that community felt under pressure as well, and we've been conscious about that.
Hey, well, ladies and gentlemen, up to date right now, and you've heard it all about the budget, and it's been handed down. So over the next few days, there will be lots of commentaries, a lot of analysis going on about who's affected, who's benefiting out of this, and which sectors, are losing out on the budget. So there you go. That's been Budget Special on Australian Indian Radio. Until tomorrow, ladies and gentlemen, it's goodbye for now.